Why a general thought U.S. airborne at Corregidor was impossible, the island that should have stopped them February 16, 1945. The Pacific is bright beneath the morning sun. Far below, in the middle of Manila Bay, sits a small island shaped almost like a tadpole. It is only a few miles long. It is narrow, rugged, covered in bomb craters, shattered trees, broken concrete, underground tunnels, ruined military buildings, steep ravines, and cliffs dropping toward the sea. And somewhere above it, American transport planes are coming. Inside those planes are American paratroopers. They are not approaching a wide battlefield. They are not looking for a huge airfield. They are not descending over open farmland. They are about to jump onto one of the worst possible places imaginable for an airborne assault. Corregidor, the island guarding the entrance to Manila Bay, a fortress that had already become a symbol of American defeat. And now, in February 1945, the United States Army wants it back. But there is one enormous problem. There is almost nowhere to land. The Americans have selected two tiny areas on the island. One is an old parade ground. The other is a small golf course. Together, they are barely large enough to absorb the force being thrown onto them. The wind is strong. The ground is wrecked. The Japanese are dug into caves and tunnels. And the transports cannot simply fly slowly over the target and release thousands of men. The aircraft have to make repeated passes. At an altitude of roughly 400 feet. That is incredibly low. Low enough that there is almost no margin for error. Too much wind, and the paratrooper could drift into the ocean. Too little control, and he could hit a ruined building, a tree, a crater, a concrete slab, a piece of twisted metal, or a Japanese position. The planners understand the danger. The soldiers understand the danger. And the Japanese commander understands the terrain. That is precisely why he believes an airborne assault is not realistic. And that decision will change everything. Because on this morning, American paratroopers are about to prove that something can be impossible on a map and still happen in the real world. The memory of 1942 to understand why Corregidor mattered so much. You have to go back 3 years. 1942, the Japanese invasion of the Philippines has shattered American defenses across the islands. American and Filipino troops have been pushed backward. Bataan has fallen. Manila has fallen. And eventually the defenders retreat to Corregidor. The island becomes the final American stronghold guarding Manila Bay. For weeks, the defenders endure artillery fire, bombing, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and relentless Japanese attacks. The island's tunnels become shelters. Its guns answer Japanese batteries. Its defenders fight while knowing that reinforcements are unlikely to come. Eventually, the position becomes untenable. Corregidor falls. For Americans, the name becomes associated with one of the darkest moments of the Pacific War. But 3 years later, the war has changed. The United States has returned to the Philippines. American forces have landed on Luzon. Manila is being attacked, and General Douglas MacArthur is determined to reclaim the islands. But Corregidor still sits in the entrance to Manila Bay, and as long as the Japanese control it, the island remains a threat. It can interfere with shipping. It can serve as a defensive position. It can become a rallying point for Japanese troops. And perhaps most importantly, Corregidor is symbolic. In 1942, American soldiers were forced to surrender there. In 1945, American soldiers intend to return. But there is a problem. The Japanese have had years to understand the island. They know its caves, its ravines, its cliffs, its tunnels, its artillery positions, and its beaches. The Americans have already learned what happens when you attack Corregidor from the obvious direction. The Japanese themselves had suffered terrible losses when they assaulted the island in 1942. The Americans do not want to repeat that experience. So instead of simply attacking from the beaches, they decide to attack from above. The crazy idea, the plan sounds almost absurd. Parachute troops onto Corregidor, seize the high ground, then bring infantry in from the sea. It is a combination assault. Airborne troops from above, amphibious troops from below, aircraft overhead, naval guns offshore, and American ground forces moving toward the same objective from different directions. In theory, it is brilliant. In practice, it is terrifying. Corregidor is only about 3.5 miles long and roughly 1.5 miles wide at its widest. The key terrain is topside. It dominates the island. And near topside are the two areas selected for the parachute drop, a parade ground, and a small golf course. These are not huge fields. They are tiny. Each is roughly 300 meters by 200 meters, and they are not clean. They are not smooth. They are not prepared for an airborne landing. American bombs have already smashed the area. Buildings have been destroyed. Trees have been shattered. The ground is full of craters. Concrete and debris are everywhere. Imagine trying to land there on your feet. Now imagine doing it while descending beneath a parachute. Now imagine doing it while carrying a rifle, ammunition, equipment, and combat gear. Now imagine doing it while enemy soldiers are shooting. And now imagine that the wind is strong enough to carry you hundreds of feet away from your intended landing zone. That is the challenge facing the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team. The Japanese defenders have a commander named Akira Itagaki. And this is where the popular version of the story sometimes gets the details wrong. This was not a German general. It was a Japanese Imperial Navy captain. Itagaki commanded the Japanese garrison on Corregidor, and his assessment of the island was brutally logical. An airborne assault appeared unreasonable. The island was too small. The terrain was too dangerous. The available landing areas were too limited. The winds could carry parachutists into the sea. The defenders could use the island's caves and tunnels to survive bombardment, and any airborne force that landed would be isolated. There was another problem. The Japanese had actually been warned about the possibility of an American parachute attack, but knowing that an enemy might attempt something is not the same as believing he will actually do it. Itagaki studied the terrain, and the conclusion was simple. A parachute attack did not make sense. The Americans would never risk it, or so the Japanese believed. That assumption would become one of the most important decisions of the battle, because the Japanese did not prepare the main airborne landing areas for a major parachute assault. They did not build the kind of extensive anti-airborne defenses the Americans feared, and that meant the Americans had something more valuable than a perfect landing zone. They had surprise. The American plan. The American planners knew the operation was dangerous. They did not pretend otherwise. The 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team was commanded by Colonel George M. Jones. His mission was brutally straightforward. Get the paratroopers onto topside, secure the landing areas, destroy the Japanese defenders, then connect with the infantry coming from the sea. The operation depended on coordination. The troop carrier pilots had to know the plan. The paratroopers had to know the plan. The infantry had to know the plan. The Navy had to know the plan. The supporting aircraft had to know the plan. And everybody had to understand what would happen if the plan started falling apart. Because airborne operations are naturally chaotic. Once a paratrooper leaves an aircraft, he is no longer part of a neat formation. The wind can separate him. The terrain can separate him. The enemy can separate him. His unit can disappear beneath smoke, dust, trees, or explosions. His radio might fail. His commander might be killed. His planned landing point might suddenly be occupied by the enemy. So the Americans trained their soldiers to continue the mission even when the original plan stopped working. The paratrooper had to understand the objective, not simply memorize an order. If he landed in the wrong place, he still had to fight. If he could not find his squad, he had to find another American unit. If communications failed, he had to use his judgment. The plan was detailed, but the battlefield would be unpredictable. And on Corregidor, the battlefield was about to become almost completely chaotic. The final days before the paratroopers arrive, Corregidor begins to disappear beneath American fire. Aircraft attack. Bombs fall. Napalm burns. Naval guns hammer the island. The Americans are trying to destroy Japanese positions, but there is a deeper purpose. They are trying to keep the Japanese underground, because the Americans know the defenders have caves. They know there are tunnels. They know the Japanese can survive bombardment. The objective is not necessarily to destroy every Japanese soldier before the invasion. The objective is to keep those soldiers underground long enough for the Americans to reach the island, and then to hit them from an unexpected direction. From the sky, the bombardment grows. The island shakes. The Japanese defenders shelter underground. The surface is being transformed into a landscape of destruction. But the American paratroopers are not watching from safety. They are preparing to jump. They know the first lift is expected to suffer heavy casualties. They know the drop zone is dangerously small. They know wind could push them into the sea. They know the ground is covered in obstacles. They know Japanese fire could appear at any moment. And still, they climb into the aircraft. February 16, 1945 morning. February 16, 1945. The first American C-47 transport aircraft approach Corregidor. Inside are paratroopers of the 503rd. The aircraft fly toward the island. The men look down, and beneath them is the place they are supposed to land. It does not look like a normal drop zone. It looks destroyed. Smoke, rubble, trees, cratered earth, ruined buildings, and beyond it, the sea. There is almost no room for error. The aircraft drop toward roughly 400 feet. The jump is about to begin. The first aircraft reaches the release point. The paratroopers go, one after another, then another aircraft, then another. The sky begins to fill with parachutes. White canopies appear above the battered island. For a few moments, the Japanese do not react strongly. The bombardment has kept many of them under cover. The first pass receives little opposition. The Americans are coming down, and something extraordinary is happening. The attack that the Japanese believed could not realistically happen is happening. The first paratroopers hit the ground. Some land safely, some do not. The drop zone is unforgiving. A parachute can slow a man, but it cannot make a destroyed battlefield safe. A soldier touches down. His boots hit rubble. He falls, gets up, looks for his weapon, looks for his unit, looks for the enemy. Another man lands nearby. Another lands somewhere else. the formation begins to scatter. This is exactly what airborne doctrine warns about, but the Americans are trained for it. They begin gathering themselves. Small groups form. Men who were strangers seconds earlier become a fighting team. They move, they shoot, they secure positions, and somewhere beyond the intended drop zone, some paratroopers have drifted away. The wind has taken them. This is supposed to be a disaster. Instead, it produces one of the most consequential moments of the entire operation, because some of those Americans land close to a Japanese observation position, and Captain Itagaki is there. The commander who believed an airborne attack was not feasible, is suddenly confronted by American paratroopers who have landed where they were never supposed to be. The battlefield has violated the assumptions of the map. The Americans are on the island, and they are already fighting. The commander is gone in the confusion. The American paratroopers form an improvised group. They engage the Japanese, and Captain Akira Itagaki is killed. Think about what that means. The Japanese commander who had assessed the terrain, the man whose judgment helped convince the defenders that an airborne assault was not feasible, is gone almost immediately after the attack begins. There is no dramatic headquarters meeting, no long warning, no time to rebuild the defensive plan. The commander is dead, and the communications network is already suffering from days of bombardment. Telephone lines have been damaged. The Japanese defenders are increasingly dependent on couriers. That is a nightmare in a battle where everything is happening at once. The Americans are scattered, but moving. The Japanese are dug in, but increasingly disconnected, and the island is being attacked from both land and sea. The Japanese have been caught between two assumptions. They believed an airborne assault was impractical, and they believed the bombardment would precede a more conventional attack. Instead, the Americans combine both. The sky becomes the first battlefield, the sea becomes the second, and the island itself becomes a maze of close combat. The second battlefield while the paratroopers are landing, American infantry is approaching from the water. The 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry is moving toward the island. The amphibious force heads toward the beaches. The Japanese defenders begin firing. The American soldiers come ashore. Mines explode. Machine guns open fire. Vehicles are hit. A Sherman tank is lost. A self-propelled gun is lost. A 37mm anti-tank gun is lost. The beach is not empty. The Japanese are fighting, but something has already gone wrong for them. The Americans are not attacking in the way the Japanese expected. The paratroopers are already establishing themselves on the high ground. The infantry is attacking from the sea. The bombardment has kept many defenders underground, and by the time the Japanese understand what is happening, American forces are already inside the fortress. The assault has not been clean. It has not been easy, but it has achieved something crucial. Surprise. The price of the first drop, the first airborne lift, is more dangerous than planners had hoped. The landing casualties are heavy. Men are injured by the ground. Some are killed. Some parachutes malfunction. Some soldiers land among debris. Others are scattered. The Americans had expected casualties, but now the real question appears. Should they stop the next drop? Imagine being responsible for the operation. You have just watched your soldiers jump into a tiny, dangerous area. The casualty rate is already high. The second lift is waiting. Another group of American soldiers is sitting inside aircraft. They are ready to jump, and someone has to decide whether to send them. Colonel Jones decides to continue. The 2nd Battalion comes in, and the second drop is less disastrous. The Americans are gaining strength. The 1st Battalion is scheduled to jump the next morning, but by the end of the first day, Jones makes another decision. He requests that the next airborne drop be cancelled. The remaining battalion should come by sea. This is an important detail, because the operation was not about proving that paratroopers could jump no matter what. It was about accomplishing the mission. The 1st airborne assault has achieved its purpose. The Americans are on topside. The high ground is being secured. The amphibious troops are ashore. And now, there is no reason to risk more men simply to prove a point. The 1st Battalion comes in by sea. The Americans adapt, and that flexibility becomes one of the keys to victory. Topside, the Americans now hold the high ground, but the battle is far from over. Corregidor is not simply an island. It is a fortress. The Japanese are hiding in caves, tunnels, ravines, bunkers, underground positions. Every time the Americans capture one position, another can appear nearby. Every cave can become a firing position. Every tunnel can conceal soldiers. Every ravine can hide an ambush. This is where the airborne assault becomes something different. The parachute landing was the dramatic moment, but capturing Corregidor is going to be a grinding infantry battle. The Americans move through the ruins. Aircraft attack suspected Japanese positions. Naval guns strike targets. Artillery moves forward. Tanks provide direct fire. Then infantry advances. If the Japanese position survives, Engineers and demolition teams approach. Flamethrowers are used. Explosives are used. The Americans seal or destroy entrances, and then they move to the next position. There is no simple victory. There is only one bunker, then another, then another. The Japanese fight back. The Japanese defenders do not surrender easily. They know what Corregidor means. They know that the Americans have returned. They know that the island is being lost, but they continue fighting. Counterattacks erupt. Japanese soldiers emerge from defensive positions. Some launch suicidal attacks. The Americans respond with machine guns, artillery, mortars, small arms, and close-range fire. The fighting becomes brutal. The Japanese are outmatched in firepower, but they are not passive. They use the terrain. They use the tunnels. They use the caves. They fight from concealed positions. And sometimes the Americans have to advance only after destroying the position in front of them. Corregidor is becoming a battlefield of meters, not miles. A few yards, a bunker, a tunnel entrance, a destroyed building, a ridge, a ravine. The Americans take ground, and then have to hold it. The strange advantage of chaos at first glance. The American airborne landing seems like a chaotic mistake. The men are scattered. The drop zones are tiny. The wind is unpredictable. The terrain is terrible. The radios can fail, and soldiers may land far from their units. But there is a strange advantage. The Japanese are also dealing with chaos. The American paratroopers may be scattered, but they are moving toward the same objective. The Japanese defenders are fighting a decentralized battle without reliable communication. Their commander is dead. Their telephone lines have been damaged. Couriers struggle to move through the battlefield. The defenders cannot always determine where the Americans are, and that means the very disorder that threatens the Americans also disrupts the Japanese. The Americans have trained their men to improvise. The Japanese have prepared to defend the island, but they have not prepared for Americans appearing in unexpected locations. The difference is critical. One side is adapting to chaos. The other is trying to understand it. The terrain that made it impossible. This is where the original question becomes more interesting. Why did the Japanese commander believe the airborne assault was impossible? Because he was not crazy. His reasoning made sense. Corregidor really was an awful place for paratroopers. The island was small. The landing zones were tiny. The wind was dangerous. The terrain was broken. The coastline was close. The sea was everywhere. The defenders could potentially shoot at descending aircraft and soldiers. And once paratroopers landed, they would initially be lightly equipped compared with conventional infantry. An airborne assault normally requires space. You need room for aircraft, room for soldiers to land, room for units to assemble, room to bring in reinforcements, room to move supplies. Corregidor offered almost none of this, so the Japanese conclusion was understandable. The American conclusion was different. The Americans did not ask whether Corregidor was a good place for a parachute assault. They asked whether it was possible, and then they built a plan around the answer. That distinction matters, because military history is full of operations that look foolish until they work. The risk was not ignorance. The American commanders knew the risk. They knew exactly what could go wrong. The planning estimates expected significant casualties. The men knew the landing zone was dangerous. The pilots knew the aircraft had to fly low. The Navy knew the operation needed support. The infantry knew it had to connect with the airborne force. And the planners understood that the first airborne lift might not look anything like the plan. But the Americans had something else. Experience. The 503rd had already fought in the Pacific. Its soldiers were not entering combat for the first time. They had learned how quickly plans collapse. They had learned that a squad leader might suddenly become the senior surviving leader. They had learned that radio communication could disappear. They had learned that a soldier might have to make a decision without asking permission. And on Corregidor, that experience mattered. The 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team was not simply a group of soldiers trained to jump from aircraft. They were a specialized combat formation, and their mission required something beyond courage. It required discipline. A paratrooper could not simply land and start shooting randomly. He had to understand the mission, secure the drop zone, link up, destroy Japanese resistance, hold the high ground, support the amphibious assault, and continue even when units were scattered. The Americans had created a system in which individual initiative could support the larger plan. That is why the airborne operation did not collapse when soldiers landed outside their intended areas. The men knew what they were supposed to accomplish. They did not need every movement dictated from headquarters. That became one of the most important advantages of the operation. The Japanese had a defensive plan, but the Americans had a mission. And when the battlefield changed, the mission remained. 6 days of fighting topside does not fall in a single dramatic charge. The Americans have to clear it, day after day, position after position. The fighting moves through destroyed military facilities, through ravines, around bunkers, toward caves. The Americans use firepower to force Japanese defenders from their positions. Then infantry moves in. If the enemy retreats into a tunnel, the tunnel becomes the next objective. If the enemy returns after dark, the Americans prepare for it. A Japanese position captured during the day can become a target at night. American soldiers learn the pattern. Withdraw at the right moment. Prepare supporting fire. Wait. Let the Japanese return, then destroy the position again. The battlefield becomes a deadly cycle. The Japanese are fighting with determination, but they are losing the ability to influence the larger battle. The Americans have the sea, the air, artillery, tanks, infantry, paratroopers, engineers, and naval support. The Japanese have caves and determination, but the imbalance is becoming impossible to overcome. The explosion under Malinta Hill. Then comes one of the most terrifying moments of the battle. Malinta Hill. Beneath it are tunnels and huge quantities of ammunition and explosives. The Japanese have used the underground complex as shelter. Now the Americans are closing in. On the night of February 21st, the tunnels explode. The blast is enormous. The earth shakes. The underground complex is devastated. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers die. The explosion transforms the battlefield. Some survivors emerge. Others move toward the eastern portion of the island. A group gathers for a counterattack, but American firepower is waiting. Artillery, indirect fire, small arms. The Japanese attack. The Americans respond. The counterattack fails, and the Japanese defenders continue to retreat. The fortress is being crushed from the inside. The myth of the perfect operation. It is tempting to describe Corregidor as a perfect American operation. It was not. The parachute landing caused serious injuries. Some soldiers died before they could even begin fighting. The drop zones were too small. The wind was dangerous. The first lift suffered more casualties than expected. The remaining airborne battalion was eventually brought in by sea. The Japanese still fought fiercely. American soldiers were killed. Vehicles were destroyed, and the island took days to clear. That is precisely what makes the operation remarkable. The Americans did not win because everything went according to plan. They won because the plan was designed to survive failure. When the first drop produced heavy casualties, they reassessed. When the terrain scattered the paratroopers, the soldiers regrouped. When communications failed, leaders acted. When Japanese defenders emerged from caves, American firepower was brought forward. When the next airborne drop became unnecessary, the Americans canceled it. This was not blind bravery. It was calculated risk. The battle moves east by February 24th. Topside is largely secure, but Corregidor is not finished. The Americans push eastward. Bottom side remains. Japanese defenders are still hiding, still resisting, still launching attacks. But now the Americans have momentum. The original impossible landing has become an established beachhead. The paratroopers are no longer isolated. The infantry has arrived. The island is being systematically cleared. Every Japanese position becomes another target. Every cave becomes another problem to solve. And slowly, the Japanese defensive system collapses. February 26th, shortly after 11 in the morning on February 26th, organized Japanese resistance effectively ends. An underground arsenal at Monkey Point is detonated. The explosion kills many of the remaining defenders. The battle is nearly over. The island that had once symbolized American defeat is now back in American hands. But there is one final moment still waiting. The moment that will transform the battle from military operation into historical symbol. March 2nd, 1945. March 2nd, Corregidor. American soldiers stand on the island. The Japanese have been defeated. The battlefield is scarred. Buildings are destroyed. The ground is cratered. The tunnels have become graves. The island looks nothing like the fortress it once was. But the American flag is going back up. General Douglas MacArthur returns. 3 years earlier, he had left the Philippines under orders to escape the Japanese advance. Now he is back, and Corregidor is back with him. The American flag rises. The symbolic importance is enormous. This is not simply the capture of another Pacific island. It is the reversal of one of America's most painful defeats of the early war. Corregidor has changed hands again, but this time, the Americans came from the sky. Why the impossible attack worked so why did the airborne assault succeed? It was not because Corregidor suddenly became easy. It remained difficult. It was not because the Americans had a perfect drop zone. They did not. It was not because the Japanese were weak. They were not. And it was not because American paratroopers simply got lucky. Luck played a role. But luck alone cannot explain the operation. The Americans succeeded because they combined several advantages: surprise, firepower, airborne troops, amphibious troops, naval gunfire, air support, experienced soldiers, detailed coordination, and decentralized leadership. The Japanese commander looked at the terrain and saw an obstacle. The Americans looked at the same terrain and saw an opportunity. The terrain was difficult, but it also created a psychological advantage. The Japanese did not expect the Americans to attempt the very operation the terrain seemed to prohibit. That is the paradox. the worse the landing zone looked, the less believable the attack became. And the less believable the attack became, the more effective surprise could be. The most dangerous part was not the jump. The parachute jump gets all the attention. The white canopies, the low altitude, the tiny drop zone, the ruined battlefield. But the most dangerous part of the operation may have come afterward. Once the soldiers reached the ground, they had to survive. They had to find each other. They had to fight Japanese defenders. They had to secure the high ground. They had to hold the landing zones. They had to coordinate with infantry. They had to clear caves. They had to survive counterattacks. They had to continue after losing men. The jump was only the beginning. A paratrooper can survive a landing and still lose the battle. The Americans had to convert the airborne landing into a permanent foothold. And that is exactly what they did. What the Japanese got right. There is another side to this story. The Japanese assessment was not completely irrational. If you look only at the physical geography of Corregidor, their conclusion makes sense. A conventional airborne landing required space. Corregidor did not have enough. The island was exposed to wind. The drop zones were surrounded by hazards. The defenders had underground positions. And any American unit landing outside the intended area could potentially be isolated. The Japanese were correct about the risk. What they got wrong was the American willingness to accept that risk. They assumed the Americans would behave according to conventional expectations. They did not. The Americans were willing to make an operation so dangerous that the Japanese believed it could not realistically happen. That is the key lesson. Sometimes the enemy's strongest assumption can become his weakest point. The American soldier on the ground for the individual American paratrooper. None of this was theoretical. Imagine standing inside a C-47. The engine is loud. The aircraft shakes. You are carrying combat equipment. You know what waits outside. A few hundred feet below is an island covered with enemy positions. You cannot see the whole battlefield. You cannot know where you will land. The aircraft door opens. Wind hits you. The island grows larger. You jump. For several seconds, there is nothing but air. Then the parachute opens. You look around. Other parachutes are descending, but they are not necessarily where they should be. The wind pushes you. The island moves beneath you. You are falling toward a place where men are shooting. Then the ground arrives. Hard, fast. You hit. Maybe you survive. Maybe you are injured. Maybe you land far from your unit. And now there is no time to think about the plan. You have to act. That is the real story of Corregidor. Not simply generals. Not simply maps. Not simply aircraft. The operation succeeds because thousands of individual soldiers keep moving after the plan becomes reality. The power of surprise. Surprise is often described as a military advantage. But on Corregidor, surprise becomes something much bigger. It changes the psychology of the battle. The Japanese are prepared for an American attack, but not this attack. They expect the Americans to approach from directions that make sense. Instead, American soldiers descend from the sky. That single decision forces the Japanese to react, and reaction costs time. In a battle measured in minutes, time matters. The Americans do not need the Japanese to surrender. They only need them to hesitate long enough. The paratroopers land. The infantry arrives. The high ground is seized. The Japanese command structure is disrupted, and the defenders are suddenly fighting a battle they never fully prepared to fight. That is how an impossible attack can become possible, not by eliminating the enemy's strength, but by attacking his assumptions. The cost, but victory had a price. The 503rd suffered significant casualties. Many of those casualties happened during the landing itself. That is important, because the operation should never be remembered as some effortless airborne spectacle. It was dangerous. Men were injured. Men died. Some fell into dangerous terrain. Others were killed in combat. The Japanese defenders also suffered catastrophic losses. Their underground positions became death traps. Their counterattacks failed. Their communications collapsed. And their ability to coordinate a unified defense disappeared. By the end, Corregidor was American again, but the island had been transformed into a battlefield of wreckage and graves. The real lesson of Corregidor. The greatest lesson of Corregidor may not be about parachutes. It may not even be about courage. It may be about judgment. Military commanders constantly face the same question. What does the enemy think you will not do? Because sometimes, that is exactly where you should attack. The Japanese commander looked at Corregidor and saw terrain that made an airborne assault unrealistic. The Americans looked at the same terrain and understood something different. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, the landing zones were tiny. Yes, the wind could kill. Yes, the soldiers could land in the wrong place. But if the Japanese believed the operation was too dangerous to attempt, then the danger itself could create surprise. The Americans did not remove the risk. They accepted it, and they built the operation around it. From Impossible to History on February 16, 1945, American paratroopers descended over Corregidor. They came down at dangerously low altitude. They landed on broken ground. They were scattered by wind. They suffered serious casualties. Some landed far from their intended targets. And yet, they seized the high ground. The amphibious force came ashore. The Japanese command structure was disrupted. Captain Akira Itagaki was killed. The American position expanded. The island was cleared. And by March 2nd, Corregidor was officially back in American hands. The attack had succeeded, not because it was safe, but because it was dangerous enough to surprise the enemy, not because the terrain was ideal, but because the enemy believed the terrain made the attack impossible, not because the American plan was flawless, but because American soldiers were trained to continue when the plan broke apart. That is what makes Corregidor so remarkable. The operation did not defeat geography. It exploited psychology. The image that should stay with you if you remember only one image from this story, remember the sky above Corregidor, a battered island below, a blue Pacific surrounding it, and American parachutes opening overhead, one after another. The Japanese had studied the terrain. They had looked at the island. They had understood the risks. They had concluded that an airborne assault was not feasible. And then, the sky filled with American soldiers. The impossible had arrived, not as a theory, not as a plan, but as thousands of parachutes descending toward the battlefield. The title needs one correction, and there is one final detail worth correcting. The officer connected to the impossible assessment at Corregidor was not a German general. It was Japanese Captain Akira Itagaki. That distinction matters, because history becomes more powerful when the details are accurate. Itagaki had been warned about a possible airborne attack. He studied Corregidor. He knew the terrain, and he judged a parachute assault impractical. The Americans proved otherwise, but they did not prove that the Japanese commander was foolish. They proved something more interesting. They proved that an operation can be physically unreasonable and still strategically effective, because sometimes the enemy's belief that you won't do something is exactly what makes it possible. The rock remembered today, Corregidor, is remembered as a battlefield, but its history is larger than a single battle. It represents the defeat of 1942, the return of 1945, the brutal fighting of the Pacific, and the evolution of American airborne warfare. The men of the 503rd did not land on a perfect airfield. They landed on a battlefield. They did not receive a clean welcome. They landed in a fortress. They did not have unlimited space. They had 2 tiny drop zones. They did not have perfect weather. They had wind. They did not have perfect communications. They had chaos, and still, they came. The island that seemed to make airborne warfare impossible became the place where American airborne troops demonstrated what disciplined risk could accomplish. The final moment, March 2nd, 1945. The fighting on Corregidor is over. The American flag rises again. 3 years earlier, American soldiers had been forced to leave. Now, they have returned. The island has changed hands. The fortress is broken. The tunnels are silent. The guns are quiet. The parachutes are gone. But the memory remains. A tiny island in Manila Bay, where an airborne operation seemed too dangerous to attempt, became the stage for one of the most audacious American assaults of the Pacific War. And perhaps that is why the story still matters. Because the word, impossible, can mean 2 very different things. Sometimes it means something truly cannot be done, and sometimes, it simply means no one believes you will dare to try. On Corregidor, the Americans dared. They jumped, and history remembers what happened next. A fortress that had defeated the Americans in 1942 was retaken 3 years later by soldiers coming from the sky. The Japanese had looked at Corregidor and decided that American airborne troops could not realistically land there. The Americans looked at the same island and jumped anyway. And that is the incredible story of how the impossible became one of the most audacious airborne assaults of World War II. If you want more true stories from the hidden battles, impossible missions, and forgotten moments of World War II, subscribe, because some of history's most unbelievable moments really happened.